Good afternoon. I'm Anton Harbour, a facilitator today. We're here to discuss this book by Franz Krüger, who's adjunct professor at the new Wits Centre for Journalism. He was former head of it and founding director of its Wits Radio Academy. He writes on ethics, radio, community media, journalism, education, sustainability, and related matters. Let me give a quick introduction to the others, so that you know who we have and we can move swiftly between them as we go through. Our second speaker will be Khadija Patel. Khadija is currently the chairperson of the IPI, International Press Institute, and head of programs at the International Fund for Public Interest Media. She's former editor-in-chief of that great paper, The Mail and Guardian, and one of the founders of the news website, The Daily Vox. Many of you will know Anya Schiffrin, Director of the Technology, Media and Communications Specialization at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. That's a long name, Anya, a long title. And she lectures at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. She's worked as a journalist in many countries for many publications, a former Knight Bagahot Academic Fellow in Business Journalism, and serves on a number of boards, including the Open Society Foundation's Program on Independent Journalism, their Global Board, and others. Theodora Dame Adjin-Tettey, I hope I've pronounced that reasonably well, is a lecturer at the Department of Communication Studies at the University of Ghana, research associate also at our fellow School of Journalism and Media Studies, Rhodes University, here in South Africa. She researches and has published academic papers and book chapters, presented her research in many places in communications, media studies, and journalism. Okay, what I'm going to do is ask Franz to kick off by giving a short overview of the work we had to discuss, the Greening Africa's news deserts, and then ask our other three speakers to onto it, bring in their own research, and we'll take it from there. The floor is yours, Franz.
Thanks so much, Anton, and thanks, colleagues, for joining us here for the discussion today. But let me, in the meantime, just try and summarize the study that we're talking about. So, as you've said, Anton, I mean, the study is called Greening Africa's News Deserts. And I thought that I would start by just saying one or two things about the context and the background. I mean, as we all know, and as many of you have written and talked about, there is an international crisis, really, around the business model underlining journalistic media. And it has to do with the technical platforms, it has to do with audiences moving elsewhere. And I mean, it's created a lot of words, a lot of thinking. And I thought that one of the questions that really we needed to consider was whether it simply translates into the local sphere, and also whether it simply translates easily into the African context. I mean, I was at a webinar earlier this week, and somebody made exactly that kind of argument. You know, newspapers in the US, in Europe, are struggling, and how much worse is it in parts of Africa? Well, it is worse, but I think it's also different. And I think one of the things that I wanted to do was to understand a little bit about that difference. And one of the issues that really stands out for me is that sustainability, particularly of community media, is a much older concern for people in the global south. I mean, whether it's in Africa or Latin America or elsewhere, donors and others have worried endlessly about sustainability of media, particularly in poor communities. It seems to me that there are real blind spots in the literature, and experiences from the global south are simply not seen sufficiently. It seems easy to extrapolate from experiences in the US and Europe, and say, well, it's like that, but perhaps worse. And there are so many aspects, and some of them, I will touch on in so many ways in which things are actually quite different on this continent. I was concerned and interested to consider the position of media, as I say, as I call it, on the margins. I mean, media, local, community media, alternative media, there are lots of different terms, but those media that really are out of the metropolitan areas, out of the mainstream. Why do they matter? They matter, of course, because they create local public spheres, if one wants to refer to the Habermasian model. They create spaces where people talk, where people get informed, where people debate issues. So that's the obvious and immediate point. But secondly, they're also really important for wider information systems. We are all impoverished. It's a very South African experience, I think, and a very South African insight. We're all impoverished when we don't know what is going on in poor areas. Then we suddenly have xenophobic violence and all sorts of things happen, and it seems like it's out of the blue. The whole country, the nation, the whole information ecosystem is impoverished when we lack input from the marginal areas. Africa has many news deserts. I mean, it's a term that I think was developed first in the US, and it's a very evocative term, but it is very common here. We have huge information inequalities, which really need to be taken seriously, as I say, for their own sake. And what are some of those specifics? Firstly, of course, there are issues of scale and resources. Those things are fairly obvious, although I think that some of the implications of these things are not always recognized. Secondly, I think community media, radio particularly, offers a whole string of opportunities that add up to real influence and power at local level. They matter, they get fought over, and as a result, they are vulnerable to capture, clientelism, conflict of various kinds. And I think we underestimate the depth of conflict and the depth of contestation that can arise out of projects of this kind. The picture that you see there is of a community radio station just south of Johannesburg that was burnt down, it turned out later, by arsonists sent by the mayor because he didn't like what was being broadcast. So the conflict can be very intense. And I think we need to take those dynamics really seriously. This is another whole discussion that we can go into, but the nature of volunteerism at local media is very different. Africa is not California. People don't volunteer because they have spare time and it's fun. They volunteer because it's a step up. It's a way of getting out, often, of poverty. And that creates a completely different dynamic, which needs to be understood. So this paper presents itself or sees itself as a kind of policy paper. What can be done? And it seemed to me that once one has developed a bit of understanding of the landscape, it is useful to set out a couple of principles. Firstly, I think it was Clinton who famously had on his wall, it's the economy stupid. Well, I'm saying it's the system stupid, right? It's the information system, it's the way in which things work in a general sense. That we need to understand and need to take seriously. I think if you're going to offer support, you need to focus where the need is greatest. Of course, that's another whole discussion, is how you decide that, right? But nevertheless, I mean, I think we have to take information inequalities very seriously. They matter for stability, they matter for justice, they matter for advancement of a whole lot of people. I think it's important to focus on quality journalism, and that also means independence, right? We need to design interventions, design support measures that support quality independence. Not all media are equal. I mean, people talk about the hate media that emerged in Rwanda, for instance. I mean, other media are simply jukeboxes or platforms for advertising. I mean, there's nothing kind of inherently wrong about that, but we need to be clear that if we're going to intervene, then let's intervene in favor of quality information that adds to citizens' ability to operate. I think we need to keep much more of an eye on what's happening at local level. I mean, I talked about the kind of capture that happens, and it's often missed. You know, the big international media freedom organizations don't say very much about the quality of interference, the lack of independence at local level. This may be controversial, but I think we need to think carefully about how we deal with different platforms. I mean, I think, of course, we need to take into account the fact that people are moving online, and we need to be moving in that direction. But we need to recognize that FM radio, for one thing, still remains overwhelmingly the platform where people get information. So I think we need to basically design interventions and support where people are, where audiences are. Of course, staying open to that movement over time. So just briefly, some of the kind of points, and I mean, you'll see the detail in the study. What are the different things that can be done? I mean, governments play a critical role. And actually, I think we need to hold governments to the obligation to ensure a healthy information ecosystem. That means an enabling environment. It means paying attention to the kind of regulatory systems that you put in place. It obviously talks to media freedom issues. It talks to administrative arrangements around licensing, et cetera, et cetera. So environments can be enabling or they can be obstacles. And clearly, as civil society, as media people interested in this thing, we need to ensure that environments are enabling, are supportive of the kind of media systems that we want. Governments can offer indirect subsidy. That's not a very common thing in the global south. European governments do it very commonly, where media organizations, not just local ones, but all media organizations are exempt from VAT. The US has historically had big subsidies for postal distribution and so on and so forth. But it's not very common in the global south. There's direct funding through the kinds of funds that are set up, and that's growing. I mean, there are relatively new funds that have been set up in the MENA region. Sierra Leone, I know, is talking about such a mechanism. I mean, we have the MDDA here, and there are different funds in different countries. There's a lot of discussion to be had about how to make those work and what the kind of characteristics are to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do. Government advertising, and this is one of the areas where really the global south has a different set of concerns. It's not a thing in the north very much. But in countries like Rwanda, I think the figure that I saw was something like 90% of the advertising market is government. In Latin America, there are huge discussions about how to create frameworks that make sure that that government advertising is deployed transparently, usefully, and is not manipulated for political purposes. And then there are other kinds of funds, often cultural funds, sometimes educational funds, that can be tapped. Donors, of course, and this is the point that comes from from some of the recent writing that I've also seen. It's important to recognize media as a factor in development. There have been calls now to increase the donations, funds available to 0.1% of GDP. Coordination needs to be increased, improved, so that so that effectiveness is better. And of course, I really do think that IFPIM, Khadija's organization, New Fund, needs as much support as they can possibly get. I also feel that it's important to take the longer term view. It's the system, let's look at systemic impact. What are media themselves? What's open to them to do? I mean, firstly, I think it's really important to recognize that there's no magic bullet. Mixture of sources of funding is probably the road to take. I mean, our MDDA here is looking for a model for sustainability, and I think there's an assumption there that there's like a pattern that you can just pick up somewhere and apply, and then everything will be fine. I think that's just it's ill-conceived. I think it is always a struggle. I think circumstances will differ from place to place. And I think the quicker we look at all of these different sources, the better. I think there are opportunities to share back-end functions. It's very important. I think the networks that exist are very important. There have been attempts to organize joint advertising sales. earlier this week, there was another webinar where that was discussed quite extensively. The East African Radio Service is an interesting initiative. Of course, I mean, as everybody says, it's important to experiment with business models and to focus on the essentials, on the important stuff, quality content and real service to audiences. Just about finally, this question of digital power. I mean, the source of this problem ultimately is that people are moving to get their information elsewhere, and the money is following them into the pockets of the digital platforms. I think that while small projects can earn some money from digital ad sales, banner ads and the like, it's very limited. Anton van Zyl of the Association of Independent Publishers here had calculated that that kind of income can contribute about 7% to a business. Clearly, that's not a very large amount. I mean, it's obviously worth having. Nobody's saying it should be ignored, but it's not mainly about that. But I think it's important to recognize that it's a political issue. It's an international issue where the technical giants, the tech platform giants must put money back into these ecosystems. I mean, there's been some discussion about the bargaining code that the Australians have introduced. I mean, Anya's written about that. And I think there are issues around paying taxes into national jurisdictions. But these are things that really need collective effort and political. These are big players, and they are not easily persuaded. And that's it. I think thanks for paying attention. I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Franz. I'm going to go straight on. Rebecca has joined us from CAS, so I'm going to ask her and CAS back to this project that Franz has been doing. So I'm going to ask her just to say a few words.
Thank you, everyone. I apologize. There was a technical issue that meant I could not join you on time, so I've interrupted your program. So I'm going to be very quick in just speaking about the work of CAS and the media program. So as Anton has said, my name is Rebecca Spanda. I am the program manager at CAS Media Africa. For those of you who don't know, CAS is a German nonprofit independent political foundation, and we work across the globe to strengthen democracy. So we have 3 media programs, one based in Asia, another in Southeast Europe, and us based here in Johannesburg. And whilst we're based in Johannesburg, we are actually a regional program, and we work in both Anglophone and Francophone Africa. So to do our work, we partner with media owners and other media stakeholders across the continent to address and counter issues such as misinformation, media credibility, and the impacts of the digital world on sustainable journalism. And this particular project with Franz falls into one of our crucial areas of concern that we address every year, and that is funding models to enable the sustainability of media houses, especially in light of the way that the digital world has affected media. And we are honored to have partnered with Franz in the production of Greening Africa's News Deserts. And I trust that the conversations that stem from this publication will inspire the increased support of sustainable and African, models for sustainable local journalism across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to go straight across to Khadija to pick up on what Franz has said.
Thanks very much, Anton, and thanks, Rebecca and Franz. Before I begin, I just want to say that CAS really are doing great work in Africa. I'm just struck by the number of interactions I've had with them just this year, and the number of broad initiatives. And I think that CAS is an example of how a foreign foundation can actually assist a local ecosystem very, very well when it is done with a with a very context-specific approach. So Franz, I think that you've asked a very important question because it's a question that I'm asked often. The problem that we're confronting is not unique to us. It is a global problem. So what makes it worse in places like Africa? Why is it so bad here when people in France will tell you that the media is in trouble there. The US issues are perhaps best documented. So what makes it particularly bad here? And I think that you've touched on the first thing is, there's a lack of government subsidy. But also I think that, there's also the problem of a lack of independence as well for much of media in various contexts in this region. But there's also a very more realistic factor as well, in that Africa remains struggling with development. And one of the key things that have helped in other contexts is reader-generated revenue schemes that have helped. And they have a limitation in contexts where audiences have not that much disposable income. So, we're going to reach a ceiling at some point because that model has some success in some contexts. And I think that in South Africa, we've seen an organization like the Daily Maverick, for example, through its membership model, that has had some success through generating funds through its readership, and it's done it in a very clever way and continues, I think, to be hailed as a success of that kind of model. But the Daily Maverick still continue to rely on other forms of funding as well to keep the lights on. Similarly, News 24, I think, have perhaps launched the best digital news subscription service in South Africa. But out of a readership of about 10 million, I think they've got about 100,000 subscribers. So what we're also dealing with is the potential for widening information inequality. Access to information, access to information is a human right. So how do we ensure that that is properly catered for? So for those reasons and many others, the problem does feel a lot more severe. It is a lot more severe in places like sub-Saharan Africa. And Franz mentioned community media, and I think that if we look at what the pandemic has done to community media in South Africa again, I think it was community media that was hardest hit actually by the pandemic in South Africa. I know that a number of promising print titles, for example, that were trying to do clever things with print, even though it is a very analog mode, just did not survive. And there are a number of examples like that. So the nearness, I would say, to not surviving is a lot closer for organizations here. And so we need to understand, what will happen. And I think that Franz is absolutely right. We need to start thinking about systems change, because it's not enough to think about saving one or two organizations. And I think this is this kind of thinking that, as funders, that I hope that, I don't think all funders can do it, but certainly at the International Fund, what we're saying is that it's not enough to, to sustain or save one or two organizations per context or per geography, but rather trying to understand how do we shift systems forward. How do we ensure that systems are able to change in a way that supports media? And that is a long way away, to be honest. I think that it is at least a 10-year project. Things like, regulating the tech platforms, changing tech subsidy regimes, all of that we know is going to take a good few years to get there, even when we have the political support for that to happen. So what happens in the meanwhile? And I think that this is where the International Fund comes in. And I think, Anya has always been a vocal support of the International Fund, and perhaps she'll, talk a little bit more about, why. But what we're trying to do is to ensure that, first of all, there is a runway, that organizations have just a little bit of breathing room. I'm saying organizations, but organizations that is direct publishers, but also the broader ecosystem around news media surviving. So that includes, all your allied services that come with news media organizations. We see ourselves as supporting entire systems. That is really, really urgent. And I think that, what we've seen, we're in the midst of deciding our first grants, which those announcements will be made in the next couple of weeks. And through our first open call, we've seen the ways in which different contexts need very different kinds of approaches. And I think that is essential. A lot of funding has been damaging, in my experience, in the way that it has forced kind of a cookie cutter approach, especially in our region. We know that there's often a lot of funding for things like training and capacity building. When when I was at the Mail and Guardian, the thing that I would say is, just give me the freaking money and I'll train journalists in my newsroom. So I think that the need to actually think about what is needed, not to say that capacity building and training is not needed in some contexts, but it's perhaps a different kind of capacity building and training. So we want to try to work, through regional offices that will have more bespoke in-country strategies to try to find ways in which we shift systems forward. So look forward to speaking a bit more just now. Thanks, Anton.
Thank you, Khadija. Let me just say to our audience, if you have, please put questions into the Q&A field, and I will come to them after our speakers have had their turn. Over to you, Anya.
Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here, and I just wish we were all in person. So many things to say. First of all, I wanted to second the great appreciation for Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I think that the leadership they're showing in terms of supporting thinking and policy around journalism is really important. With my students and with Theodora, we wrote 2 reports called Saving Journalism that looked at work around the world. And I just think it's terrific that now, France has built on that and is complementing and pushing the discussion further. France, the fact that you cited Harry Dugmore, that you cited so many colleagues, I think is really crucial. I think you've made a tremendous contribution, in fact. We've absolutely had a shortage of specific African material that really looks at the differences. And I think by, bringing together and distilling so much information, you've contributed a real service and something that we can take forward. So I just wanted to recognize how important I think that this paper is. And I know I'll be going back to it over and over again. One of the things that you highlighted, and which I tried to look at too, is, what can we learn from the rest of the world? How can we adapt other ideas? We all feel wistful when we're in Europe because they've done so much to support media. And then we always think, how can we apply it in our country, right? And I feel like some of the questions that people have in Africa are similar to the questions that we have here, right, in America. How can you design policies that help everybody? And should you? Or is that just a dispersal? In the US, right, many people have looked at what Australia did, the News Media Bargaining Code, and said, well, that just helped Rupert Murdoch. We can't do anything like that because that's going to benefit large companies, and we need to help small local outlets. And I think that in the US, one of the tensions, in fact, many parts of the world, are between the large and the small outlets. And that's tough because when you're designing policy, you're naturally designing for the people that already exist. It's hard to design policy for the people that don't exist. So I think that's a tension I've seen. And then in the US, we're so terrified of Donald Trump coming back that we're almost paralyzed. We keep saying, how can we possibly design policy that won't get misused? What if a bad government comes into power and all of a sudden they've got control over money for journalism? And I've heard this exact same fear in Africa and Latin America too. I remember I was talking to Janina Signini a couple of years ago about our reports. And she was like, don't try that on us. We're not Switzerland. You know, this would not work in Latin America. So I think globally, you know, there's worry about policy, there's uncertainty as to how it can be designed. There's a fear that, you know, oh, it might be unequal. And when I was in Australia last summer, I was so impressed because they were utterly pragmatic. The Greens, the Liberals, who are the conservatives, just said, you know what? We need to get Google and Facebook to pay for news. May not last forever. May, you know, certainly more of it will go to Murdoch than to others, but they joined hands to get it done. And then Minderoo Foundation, Emma McDonald, who's a lawyer, actually worked with a lot of the smaller outlets to get them to bargain collectively to get money. So slowly, more and more outlets were brought into the bargaining code in Australia. And I think something like 200 million Australian have been injected into journalism in the last couple of years. That's what I was told. So I think I was pretty inspired because I think it's really important for journalism organizations and donors to unite around these questions. I think, I don't want to talk too long, but you know, I just thought all your points about coordination and looking at the larger system are incredibly important. Maybe I'll just, I don't want to dominate here, but maybe my last couple points. Number one, you had so many good ideas. Sorry, someone's asking me a question. Oh, I have no idea if I'm cutting off. I hope I'm not. But anyway, a couple things. One is, Franz, you had so many good ideas. And so one thing I'm really interested in is, do you have a hierarchy? Are there things you think need to be done first? Is the first role to push government to raise their support? Is it to get the donors to coordinate? You know, what would you say we should focus first? Khadijah's totally right that I've been a huge supporter of your fund for public interest media. I'm so glad in a way, you know, I never bought the idea there would be a new business model. I just thought that was absurd for a whole lot of reasons. And I thought that the numbers that you've all outlined are really chilling. You know, that digital advertising is making up 7% of revenues. You know, Khadija had some pretty shocking numbers as well about, you know, subscription. I never bought the membership thing because you're asking people to give time as well as money. So who's got time as well as money? You know, that's clearly always going to be a small part of revenue. And I think, you know, as people are coming to this realization that survival and sustainability are tough, they're naturally coming together and trying to think about big picture interventions like what Khadija is doing and the bargaining code. So I think I'd like to know, the hierarchy of what can be done. You know, how you've talked a little bit about the balance of large and small. And then I think most important for me is how can we help? Courtney Radish is having a conference at UCLA in March. We're doing something at Columbia where we're bringing regulators together to talk about regulating big tech. And I would, love to know from all of you, what are the first things that we should be telling and discussing, with African regulators? Who should be at the table? How can we help with experiences? And personally, I'm learning a lot right now. I'm writing this short paper for GFMD on journalism funds. And obviously I'll be looking very closely at what Sierra Leone is doing, the successes and difficulties in Tanzania, the work in Kenya. So I'm excited also that, African journalism, we've been saying for years, has had experience with these difficult financial problems forever. So you also have a lot to teach the rest of the world, I think. So anyway, I'll stop here, but obviously very excited by this report and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you. Straight over to you, Theodora.
Sorry, thanks very much, and thanks for having me here. I think Anya, Khadija, they've covered very much almost all the things that I wanted to say. But what I want to add is that in the African context, if you're looking at how we can green news deserts, we need reliable information. So research is also very important. Research is something, and I think that Khadija mentioned that research, you need to understand, if you want to consider the context, you need to understand the particular situation. So we need to ask, media organizations, how are they evolving? How are they making sure that they are in business and all of that? And then what are the things that they think they would need to be able, to be able to remain viable in the things that they do. And so I know that the Department of Communication Studies, University of Ghana, for instance, what we are currently doing is to assess the status of, more or less test the health of Ghanaian media. So we want to understand, what are you doing to survive? What has been the implication of the pandemic? Prior to the pandemic, what was it like, and all of that? And I think that so far we've had very, very useful information from the people that we've spoken to. And indeed, while they wait for the big decisions to be made, media organizations are trying to survive through diverse ways. And the public broadcaster in Ghana, for instance, is supposed to be a public broadcaster, but mainly they get their funding from government. And government subventions do not come early, or they don't come at all in certain instances. So what they do is to also take a more of a commercial view of things. So, and I spoke about it in the Saving Journalism Conference, where that for GBC, Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, which broadcasts to the whole nation, especially their television station, everybody in every remote region can have access to it. And what they do is that because they realize that government or state institutions would want coverage for their events, and that is what drains their resources, because sometimes they need to cover the events live. What they have done is that whenever they get any such request, they send an invoice to those institutions. And so when the revenues come, then they use it to do their news or do the important stories of society. And I think that community radio is also crucial to Africa, because even in the remotest regions, people have access to radio. In my village, for instance, people go to the farm with radio. And what some of the stations in the capital who do very important stories do is that they sort of, they have this syndicated programs, especially current affairs news programs, and they rebroadcast, or they broadcast their morning shows, which are very important to Ghanaians, because that's where we get a lot of news and then investigative stories from. And so they broadcast them in those localities. And then because of that affiliation they have with these institutions or news organizations in the capital, they sort of get citizen journalists in the communities to report on issues in the communities, or they get those in the community radio stations to also report. But then in terms of how much they can report on that, because we need local news. When we are talking about greening, it is about local content. What are the issues critical to that local community? So what they do, maybe just a drop in the ocean, but it's something that can be acknowledged. But then, they can't do much. But so that it's critical that there is funding for that. In Ghana, we don't even have any funding for community media. And so I think that when we are talking about, the big measures or the high profile measures, then we should also let governments to invest in, some form of funding for community media, because they largely rely on NGOs to survive. And so if the grants don't come, they are not able to do anything. And so I think this is also critical. And then some of the news organizations are more of conglomerates. So they have gone to, and in recent past, a lot of news organizations have gone to establish smaller radio stations in the regions. And of course, because it is their station, they rebroadcast the information, but whatever is in the capital on those channels. So there is still a gap in there which needs to be filled with proper funding, and all the things that I'm sure we'll be discussing will be crucial to all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Theodora. Thank you to all our panelists. It's a very interesting start. I've got a question from Patience Zarima aimed at Khadija and Anya. How can policy or legislation balance the business imperative with public interest? Who'd like to go first?
Khadija, I'll let you go first. While I think about it.
Yeah, I think that it's a very difficult challenge to broach, but I think that it has to be broached. I think that the method will ultimately be in the attempt to do this. I think that we have to start somewhere, and I think that in various contexts there's the beginning of action. So, for example, I think that the publishers in South Africa uniting in a competition commission appeal against the tech companies, even though I'm a little skeptical about its success, but I think it's important in beginning something. But I think that ultimately what has to be asserted is the urgency. I think, first of all, we have to understand that something has to be done. Something has to change. We have no recipe to get there yet. I think that the methods of regulation, what does regulation actually mean? And how will it be done to balance out, these various interests? Business interests on one hand, public interests on the other. But I think this is why we have to hope that democratically elected governments will act in the public interest. I think that is essential, that we have to use this moment to ensure that the absolute critical need for good information is protected. That is what is at stake. So I don't have Patience, I don't have a definitive answer, but I think that's my answer really would be, it just has to happen somehow. And, I think that whatever we have at hand, throw everything at it and let's see what works.
Anya?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Khadija. And Patience, I think you're asking a question that everybody is asking. I think maybe one way to think about it is to start from a sort of place of realism, which is the business imperative, of course, is important, but there has to be support. We just know that now. And I really loved when I was on the journalism program board at Open Society Foundation. I thought Maria Teresa Ronderos, when she came in and directed the journalism program, was just very realistic, which was folks that we're supporting won't necessarily ever be self-sufficient, but they can make huge strides. And I think that time has really borne out that point of view. So media outlets obviously have to do as much as they can to earn income and follow the business imperative, but we also have to be realistic about the fact that many of them won't make it without support. And yeah, whether it's from, Janine Warner's study that found that during the pandemic, people were getting just as much support as ever, but they were getting it from Google and Facebook rather than maybe some of the more traditional donors. So I think that's realistic. It's going to have to be a sort of mix. So there's always going to be a balance. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. And let me, people, please put your questions in the Q&A so I can put it to our panel. I have one from Peter Klutter, which is a South African focus question, but I'm going to reword it a little to make it of wider, because I think there is wider relevance in the question he asks. He asked about ICASA, our telecoms regulator. And he says, is the regulator not the biggest risk to community radio stations because of some legislation that needs to be re-looked at? And he cites, for example, the language rules that ICASA lays down here, that stations have to be multilingual, and says, shouldn't they be allowed to be language specific? And he cites the restrictions on them operating commercially as community stations. Which of our, Franz, perhaps you could start by answering if you think ICAS's regulatory process is a problem in that way?
Thanks, Anton, and thanks, Peter, for that question. You know, the fact that our community radio sector is expected to be non-profit is, I'm not sure that it's a hindrance to earning money. I think there may be room to create a small commercial broadcasting sector, just as there's a small commercial print sector. I mean, the independent publishers, you know, put out a lot of newspapers and really struggle in many ways. I think that may be an argument worth having. I think that there is value in saying, look, there is a sector that is simply non-profit, and that sector is you know, is able to go to market, is able to carry advertising. I mean, there are some countries where community broadcasters are not allowed to take ads, or only or are severely restricted in terms of the advertising that they can carry, and I think that's a problem. I don't think that I think that that's a restriction that is unhelpful. The language issue, I mean, I suppose it comes from a place where there is a feeling that certain localities are multilingual, and that therefore, you know, the community stations should broadcast to them, to the different language groups. I mean, mostly our licenses here are issued on the basis of a promise of performance. So if you're applying for a license, you say, these are the languages that we're going to broadcast in, and then that gets written into your license. I'm not aware of cases where the regulator said, you must broadcast Zulu, even if you don't want to. But certainly we have to have an ongoing discussion about what those regulations look like, what's reasonable, what also you know, stands the test of the multi-platform world that we're in. You know, to what extent is it still reasonable to kind of do separate things for broadcasters that don't apply to others? So, you know, I think it's an ongoing discussion.
Would any of our other panelists like to add to that? No? Okay, let me move to the next question. Henry Count Evans asks, he says, thank you for the interesting discussion. My question goes to Prof Krüger. You rightly note that digital transformations have disrupted journalism routines and business models, and revenues have gone down. Is it possible to learn from other sectors such as retail? How have they reinvented themselves? How sustainable is donor support in sustaining journalism? Is it possible to imagine a business model that brings money and at the same time ensures quality journalism? So there's a number of issues packed in there. Franz, take your choice.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think having a look at what happened in other sectors, you know, is really interesting, and I don't think we've done enough of it. I haven't done it myself, so I can't pull out particular lessons, but I think you raise an important and valid point. You know, others have dealt with these challenges, and it would be interesting to see what they've done. The sustainability of donor support, I'd like to bounce that at Khadija. I mean, she talks of a runway. I mean, in a sense, the runway idea suggests that you'll get donor support for a while and then you'll be able to fly on your own. I mean, perhaps Khadija would like to respond to that and indicate what that looks like. A business model that brings money and ensures quality journalism, I do think we've got examples of that. I think we've got all kinds of projects and organizations that do earn money and at the same time, you know, deliver quality. I mean, the Daily Maverick is one, in a very different world, in a very different way. I mean, the BBC is another, and so one could go down the list. So I do think there are examples of success, but again, I make the point, I don't think there's a single model. I think we have to accept that different, you know, contexts are different, and different mixes and solutions will work in different places.
Franz, if I can just add before throwing it to Khadija and others, you know, I think we have to remind ourselves that quality journalism, in the sense that journalism serves its audience and serves the public interests of its audience, is in itself a business model. I mean, it's a core of any business model that you have to produce the material that serves your audience. So I'm scared of an either or. Either it's a good business model or it's quality journalism, because it can be both in my mind. Khadija, would you like to come in there?
So yeah, Anton, thanks for the provocation. But on when I refer to a runway, I'm referring specifically to IFPIM, because the International Fund is not envisaged to last forever. The International Fund itself is envisaged to last for about 10 to 15 years at the maximum, because what we believe is that within these 10 to 15 years, we want to work with stakeholders within the ecosystem to map a way out of this. Right from the get-go, we're working with an eye to an exit. But I think that what a lot of frustration with donor support in particularly in sub-Saharan Africa is that it is often short-sighted, that it prevents you from long-term planning because donor strategies change. And I think that various private foundations who've had a really good reputation in supporting independent media in this region up until now, I know that many organizations are actually, in a state of shock as these foundations change strategies. So I think that we want to obviously prevent that. We specifically, right from the get-go, want to ensure that when we work with an organization, it is with an idea of working with them long-term, so that they are able to think long-term. Because I think that one of the weaknesses of current funding to media is that a lot of time that is spent writing proposals and writing reports could actually be spent trying to think about innovation and trying to implement new ideas. And so when a lot of the best brain power in the organization is completely focused on just trying to keep the wheels moving, so we want to try to just give organizations a cushion away from that, because what is happening is that it's not that organizations are not innovative, and that's the one thing that I'm really sensitive about this, especially when the allegation of a lack of innovation in the African media space is leveled. It's just that much of the innovation activity is aimed at survival right now, and the fact that many organizations continue to publish, continue to distribute content in very, very difficult circumstances is actually a feat of innovation. So we want to ensure that there is more room, that that there is at least the comfort of doing this. I think that some form of donor funding will continue to exist outside of the International Fund, but this will be parceled in, I think, within the greater mix of regulatory frameworks, of the national funds that may emerge, and actually trying to understand how funding for those national funds, will arrive. So some form of donor funding, I think, will always be a feature of the media landscape, but I think, sorry, I'm rambling now, Anton, but I hope I've gotten to the nub of the question there.
No, thank you. And I'm wondering if Anya wants to add, as she's been involved in donor organizations like Open Society, and can share with us if she has a concern about the sustainability of that approach.
Well, it reminds me of some of the quarrels at the World Bank about Ethiopia, literally, I think it was 30 years ago, about could you count foreign aid as part of your budget or not? Was it predictable enough? I mean, I think that it is unrealistic to expect that a lot of your grantees will become self-sufficient. I think realistically what happens is that people just move, organizations move from donor to donor or go out of business. So I wouldn't fully, I'm just not sure that's realistic. Having said that, clearly, I think there's been a real push in the last year or two. Sustainability sort of come back into fashion, interestingly. And I feel like a lot of different organizations right now are sort of working on that and trying to find ways to help outlets make money, which I think is great. But I think it's really important to not sort of overstate. And then, of course, another tension I see is this question of, do we support sort of, brave individuals, the global muckrakers with their small outlets, or is it better to put our energy onto, the large public service broadcasters that have a large audience? And that's, I feel like, a discussion that many people are having in different parts of the world and has also not been resolved, which is, again, why I found this report, Greening Africa's Deserts and the look at community radio, to be extremely helpful. I had the pleasure of hearing Theodora speaking last week, and I thought it was extraordinary. You gave us a really fantastic taxonomy of the ways that different Ghanaian media outlets are raising money. And they were kind of mind-boggling. I mean, there were things I had just never thought about. I don't know if you want to share a couple of them.
Theodora, why don't you come in there and tell us a bit more?
Yeah, so I think there is one particular media organization that you would say did not get affected by the pandemic as compared to others. And this is a media organization that decides that they will run events. And I think that they realized that they needed to survive, because it has been in existence for about 3 decades. And over the course of time, they realized that if we don't take care, we'll get out of business. So what they do is to look out for issues that are important to Ghanaians and bring people together to discuss the issues and then find solutions to the issues. So they organize a lot of high-profile events. They organize events with CEOs, government officials, and they get sponsors to, fund these events. And I believe that this is an important model because they are somewhat contributing to the solutions, of our challenges, while at the same time, generating some revenue to, fund the kinds of journalism that they do. And then in the rural areas, for instance, there is this particular community media organization that does not get any form of support from anywhere. So what they do is that, so the community realizes that this news organization is important to us and they need to survive. So what they do is, for especially the religious organizations in the communities, they have slots, program slots. And then when they come, they raise funds. They appeal to their audiences, and because they're a religious organization, they have a sort of appeal. So they appeal to their audiences to donate to the news organization. And that is how they also keep themselves, alive and surviving in that particular space. A lot of people, news organizations in Ghana now have news apps. So even the Graphic Communications Group, which is state-owned, has a news app, and it targets those who reside outside the country. And they have subscription, huge subscription base. And so the news comes in PDF format. So you can subscribe for a day, a week, a month, and then it brings them a lot of revenue. And even the radio stations, they do have news apps, and they are monetizing their social media streaming. It will interest you to note that for a lot of radio stations in Ghana, they live stream their program. So they've even changed the setup of their newsrooms so that it looks like a TV stroke a radio station, and they live stream their high profile shows, and they get a lot of people viewing, and they monetize that content as well. They have short videos, they make short videos out of their content, they put them on digital platforms, YouTube channels, and they are getting revenues from these digital channels. I think that they are also making something off these digital channels, while hoping that maybe someday there will be some regulations that will get these big tech to invest in what they do. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really very interesting. And in fact, it takes us to 5 o'clock and our hour is coming to an end. So I'm going to thank all the panelists and ask Franz just to say a few words to wrap things up.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anton, and thanks to the panelists. I mean, Theodora, thanks so much for the those examples. It just reminds us of the richness of the kinds of experimentation that one sees in media, particularly on this continent. I mean, I remember going to a media organization in the far north of Zambia who wanted to plant a forest as a fundraising initiative. I wasn't sure that it was the most effective kind of method, but there you go. It was certainly an interesting idea, and people run buses and hire out outside broadcast equipment and sell airtime, in different kinds of ways. So there are lots of examples, and I think it's a good reminder, that we need to look at the kind of excellent examples that exist out there. I noticed that there was a question about investigative journalism. I'm going to refer you to next week's African Investigative Journalism Conference, which Anton is leading. I think we're out of time here, but certainly it's an important question, and there will be a conference here in Johannesburg on that question. Khadija, thanks very much for your reflections on the donor dynamic, and I think that's one of the things that is quite specific about our experience in the global South and in Africa. You have people in the US and Europe saying, "Well, can foundations be the solution?" Well, we've got a lot of experience here, and they're probably, as Anya says, they're probably not the long-term solution. But certainly there are ways in which they can assist, particularly in the short term. You asked the question, Anya, right at the beginning about the hierarchy, and it's a good and difficult question. I mean, if I'm firstly, again, I say I think circumstances differ in different places, but if I'm pushed, I'm going to say that finding solutions to the big flow of money to the tech giants is probably the thing that we should spend time on. I'm not, I don't think we have a clear set of answers. The Australian bargaining code is certainly an interesting one. Whether that would work here, well, it certainly wouldn't work as easily. Partly, in fact, oddly, because there was a Rupert Murdoch in Australia who was prepared to put considerable media and political muscle behind a particular set of ideas. But I think, all of these things need to be explored. I think we need environments that encourage small initiatives of the kind that we've been talking about. But I think in the long run, I think that's going to give us, it's not a short-term solution, but it's going to give us most bang for our effort and our buck. So many other things that I'd like to, that one could pick up and continue the discussion. And the discussion, of course, doesn't end here; it continues. Thanks again for your participation. Thanks for all the parties that have supported this. CAS, particularly. Also FOIO, I see that some people from FOIO are here who supported, thanks to my own university, who gave me some time and space to do this, and thanks to NLA Gimlekhol and the college in Kristiansand, where I did some of this work. But thanks particularly to those here today. As I say, the discussion continues. It's important for us to find solutions that work in different places, under different contexts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Franz, and thank you to the audience and to our panel. It's really raised a lot of important issues that will be a subject of ongoing discussion. I think this is a good place to end our discussions for today. Thank you.
Thanks very much.